So hello everyone, I am Brooke McKenna. As was mentioned, I am a clinical psychology PhD student at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. And today I'm just going to briefly tell you guys about the project that was generously supported by the National Institute of Social Sciences, which is my dissertation entitled Risk and Resilience in the Intergenerational Effects of Trauma Among Black Americans. So we know that experiences of trauma can result in a lot of functionally impairing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD in children. And interestingly, there's actually lots of evidence that this is not only the case when a child experiences a trauma themselves, but also when their mother has experienced a trauma. So essentially there's this intergenerational impact of trauma on a child's mental health, specifically post-traumatic stress symptoms. And while this is the case, it is not true that every child whose mom was exposed to trauma goes on to develop those symptoms. And so essentially what my research is interested in understanding is why is it that some children do go on to develop those symptoms? What differentiates them from the other children? And in answering that question, we might be able to figure out how to intervene. One really important consideration when doing this work is the fact that PTSD and trauma does not equally impact all individuals, and in particular, Black Americans in the United States are disproportionately impacted due to higher exposure to traumatic incidences, as well as disproportionate exposure to other risk factors that we already know increase a child's risk for developing PTSD. So overall, the kind of main goals of my research program are first off to reduce the intergenerational impact of trauma on child mental health, and in particular, really prioritize the inclusion of Black American mothers and children in order to reduce this mental health inequity that we see in the United States. Towards these aims, I take a two-stepped approach. So my dissertation is comprised of two steps, the first of which is how can we identify individuals who are at an elevated risk for developing PTSD symptoms following maternal trauma. The reason this is important is because if we could answer that question, then we could assess children really early in life and see who's at that high risk and target those children for early intervention. So what I'm proposing for my first dissertation, given my interest and background in biology and combining that with the social sciences, is seeing whether genetics could be that biomarker that helps us better understand kids at higher risk. So essentially my question will be, is there something different about this baby's genetics compared to the other baby's genetics that explains why they're developing PTSD symptoms? And then if so, then as I mentioned, we could use something like genetic testing early in life in order to identify that child who's at the higher risk, provide early intervention, and ideally attenuate that intergenerational impact of trauma. One reason this is particularly important to do in Black and African American samples is that as it stands currently, the genetics field is actually very homogeneous for European ancestry individuals. So essentially most people who've participated in genetics research are of European ancestry. And so the clinical genetic tests that we use, this is already going on, they are essentially way more accurate for people who are of European ancestry. And you can see in this graph over here that actually for individuals of African ancestry, it's about a quarter of the accuracy. And so one of the goals of my dissertation is by diversifying genetics research, we're going to be able to reduce this disparity. Okay, so step one is identify children who are at that elevated risk so we can provide early intervention. The next question is, what do we actually target with that early intervention? And again, looking at this from a biological mechanism standpoint. So for my second question, I am really interested in the gut microbiome as that potential target. You may be wondering how in the world is the gut microbiome related to PTSD symptoms. We actually now know that the different types of bacteria that are inside our guts have a huge impact on our health and physiological functioning in general, including our brain functioning. And so early studies are showing that different types of bacteria that are in our gut can influence whether or not we're likely to develop something like PTSD following a trauma. This is also really exciting because unlike something like genetics, it's way easier to modify this, so it's a much more promising target for intervention. So with this question, I'm essentially going to be looking at, is there something different about the composition of this baby's gut compared to the babies who don't go on to develop PTSD symptoms? And then if so, future research could see, okay, what if we took the composition of these healthy babies, modified the baby at higher risk to look more like those healthy babies' guts? Does that actually attenuate that intergenerational impact of maternal trauma? The way that I intend to do this is working with data from 250 mother-child dyads, all of whom identify as Black or African American. And they enroll in 3 separate but related longitudinal studies where we initially enroll moms during pregnancy. They report on their experiences of trauma prior to pregnancy, childhood trauma and adversity. Then we enroll them and their babies during early life where we collect biosamples. So we collect DNA to look at their genetics, and then they are kind enough to donate their dirty diapers so that we are able to get fecal samples for the gut microbiome. And then finally, from ages 2 to 5, they come in annually, and moms are reporting on whether they're developing symptoms of PTSD. So all of this data has already been collected, and the next step is analyzing it in order to address my research questions, and this is where support from the National Institute of Social Sciences comes in. Genetics and gut microbiome data is very, very large, and it takes pretty hefty computational resources in order to analyze all of this, and so support from this award will be going towards that. And so with that, I just want to, again, thank the National Institute of Social Sciences for that support in enabling this important research, and then, of course, acknowledging everyone else who contributes to this research.